I was talking to someone yesterday and told them that I'd be talking about outsourcing global cyber norms. And they said, really? So what do garden gnomes have to do with cyber? And at that point I thought, damn, that would have been a really good topic to talk about. But as it is, we're stuck with talking about norms. So can I just check who's here to kind of look at a very academic, very in-depth, hard-hitting talk? Brilliant, because that means I don't really have to disappoint anyone. So I'm not saying that it'll all be unicorns and rainbows, but at least part of the next 45 minutes will be about setting out a slightly utopian vision for the future. And I know there's a certain bit of irony in asking a room full of InfoSec professionals to do this, but I would very much like you to kind of dispense with the cynicism and the skepticism for the next 45 minutes, keep an open mind, and embrace a level of radical creativity, I think, let's call it. If you're still with me, awesome. If you're turned off now, the door's over there. But let me just manage expectations a bit further and just introduce you to the central premise of what I hope to cover in the next 45 minutes. It all starts with the basic belief that if we want to ensure political stability and economic prosperity, we need international agreements on cyber norms. And not only do we need that agreement on the norms, we need those norms to drive action and drive a change in behavior and practices, to see it on the ground in reality. The premise is that states, through their international institutions and international fora, will not be able to deliver that for a variety of reasons, but that corporate action and the corporate world are an appropriate alternative to be driving that forward. So what we'll see, or what we want to see, is really a turning round of that traditional model of how norms are developed and rules are made. So traditionally, you have governments deciding on certain norms and setting up rules and requirements and regulations that corporates have to comply with, sort of top-down model. What we will see, or would like to see in this space, is that corporates, through voluntary agreements with each other, will drive practices and behaviors that will subsequently be codified and formalized by states. The rest of the talk will look at that in more detail. So what I'll do is just talk about why international state action in developing cyber norms is a failed endeavor. And I'll look at the current state of play and run through some of the challenges that states are facing. I'll then explain why corporate action is the way forward, primarily by looking at two examples, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord and the Charter of Trust. And I'll then draw some conclusions and run through some of the practical implications of what that means. But what I would really like to get to is leave some space for discussion at the end and leave some space for challenge from all of you at the end. So let's see how my time management goes for the rest of this. A final few caveats. I started looking at this. I became really intrigued by this whole discussion about international cyber norms, how they get derived at, but pretty soon realized that it's pretty mind-bending and pretty mind-boggling to make sense of it all. So I have taken some mental shortcuts, primarily to keep my head from exploding. I've also tried and dispensed with this usual approach of social sciences to kind of be a bit wishy-washy. So I've done or made a few more simplifications and absolute statements to kind of keep it interesting. And then the final bit is that a lot of the challenges that I'll talk about aren't necessarily unique to cyber and the cyber world. They are challenges that agreement internationally faces in other areas as well. But the beauty or the uniqueness of cyber is that there is pretty widespread agreement that something needs to be done at a global level. And due to the fact that it is a relatively new discipline that is still evolving, we do have flexibility to do things differently and, to be radically creative, and to not be bound and bogged down by legacy systems and institutions. And with that, we are ready to go. So, brief spoiler alert at the very start. The assumption is that international state action fails because there is a lack of mutual trust between actors and because enforcement mechanisms aren't effective at an international level. Therefore, any norms that can actually be agreed cannot be turned into effective action. But let's take a look at what all these norms and cyber norms are actually about. In very simple terms, there is a general understanding that the future evolution of digital technologies can be very, very good for mankind, but it also comes with a number of risks. So if we want to capitalize on the benefits, we need an agreement of how to do this, as in cyber, as in digital technology, responsibly. We need an agreement of how to keep the internet open and peaceful and secure and accessible for everyone. And we do need that agreement to be international, because don't have to tell you that cyber transcends borders. It doesn't necessarily respect national sovereignty. So we need cross-border agreement on what can and cannot be done, and a shared view and a shared understanding of what is and what isn't acceptable in cyberspace. And that does cover a number of things. It covers things like state behaviors, agreement on, whether states are able to develop offensive capabilities, when they're able to deploy them and against whom, under what circumstances. Can they spy on each other? Can they spy on the respective domestic national champions? What are the rules around that? It covers things like intelligence sharing. So how, when, under what circumstances do states and organizations within countries cooperate? It covers things like rules and regulations. So where is there agreement on what corporates and what citizens are expected and required to do to contribute to tackling cyber threats? And it covers things like cybercrime. So whether or not there is agreement on what cybercrime is in the first place and how cyber criminals are deterred and punished from doing bad things. And there have been numerous attempts of tackling those questions, of finding agreements, and giving you a full list and a rundown of what's already out there would take a very long time, and you would probably fall asleep at some point, which is definitely not what we want. But there are, take my word for it, there's lots of international, supranational, regional, bilateral agreements to tackle that. And just to give you a brief illustration of that, I've stolen a chart from NATO. Thank you very much to them for that. They call it let me just check the notes, the Venn diagram of international organizations working together for peace and security. Sounds pretty good. See that on the left-hand side of the slide, and that's already pretty complex, and the overlapping memberships, and the different but sort of similar objectives that all those organizations have set for themselves. On the right-hand side, you then have, in the colored boxes, the cyber-related agreements that those international organizations have come up with. And then in the grey boxes, you have the overlaying other additional treaties and declarations and commitments, what have you, that all purport to cover global cyber norms and agreement on what's what and what needs doing. Now, the UN have been looking at this for the past 20 years. That's just one body that's considered this for 2 decades. And we are presented with this rather jungle madness thing of overlaying and complex agreements, because no one's ever bothered to date to look at whether they are working, what they've actually achieved to date. Because, cyber is a really tricky, complex, global thing that needs tackling. So the easiest thing to do is for people to sit down, write high-level commitments, and just, build that cake layer of one thing after the other, which is, what we see at the moment. But let's pause for a moment and look at what they've actually committed to doing. So reading through the various agreements, I was actually quite surprised to see that there is a level of consensus across all of them as to what the high-level principles of agreement should be. So, what they have arrived at after 20 years of discussion in very painful, lengthy ways is that, for one, international law should be applied in cyberspace. States should not necessarily support intentional damage to systems and infrastructure, and should prevent harm to people. Pretty easy to sign up to on paper. There is a level of agreement that states should have the right to develop operational cyber capabilities. Could argue it's a bit similar to the mutually assured destruction principle. There is commitment to organizations, states, institutions working together to share information and work in partnership. There is lots of support for this fantastic concept of cyber capacity building, particularly for those countries that are currently lagging behind a bit. There is lots of support for this relatively new phenomenon of secure by design. And there's lots of support and agreement on the principle of, coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And you sort of think, well, that's pretty good. There's consensus. Happy days. What's the problem? The problem is that a lot of these principles are just that. They are principles. They are very high level. And there aren't really any detailed implementation plans of how those principles are applied and implemented and turned into concrete action on the ground. And I was sort of trying to find a good analogy and kind of come up with this, so bear with me. It's a bit like sitting down with a group of friends and you go, we're all a bit hungry. Should we go for dinner? And people go, yeah, awesome, brilliant idea, let's do that. And you go, cool, consensus. Should we go now? And someone will go, what do you mean? Like, it's 12:30. Surely dinner isn't until 7. And someone else will go, no, that's tea. Dinner is at lunchtime. And, the interpretation or the lack of agreement on what the interpretation of what you've actually just agreed to is a good example. And that's before you even start going into the whole, okay, let's have dinner. I want pizza. I want Thai. I'm vegan. I don't really eat fish. And also going over there is way too far to walk. So, that really brings us to the core of the challenges that are being faced. So I would argue that for cyber norms to be agreed and then subsequently turned into concrete action, there are two success factors that need to be fulfilled. One is, can states find international agreement on what those norms should actually be? And the answer to that question is a bit ish. There is high-level agreement on what's what, but that only really holds up so long as you don't look under the bonnet in a lot of detail. We do know that things like the 2017 UN group of governmental experts failed to reach consensus on what the norm should be. We know that the process is starting up again, except it's not a single process, but it's two processes running concurrently, one proposed by Russia, one proposed by the US, because they aren't even able to agree at UN level how they should structure their discussion about what the norm should be, never mind the outcome of the actual discussions. That's that. The second question is whether where there is agreement on norms, that can be turned into reality, can be turned into action on the ground. And I'd argue that the answer to that is not really at the moment, because that depends on two factors. One is either a shared willingness of states to agree what to do in their implementation plans that ultimately depends on mutual trust between them, which is the sort of, we all agree this is the right thing to do, let's just get on with it. Or it depends on effective enforcement mechanisms, which is the sort of, let's all just do it because we really don't like the consequences of what will happen if we don't. Geopolitics, instances of technological protectionism really hamper that mutual trust element. So states have very diverse and very diverging interests in cyberspace, and that really does make it very difficult for them to develop that shared willingness and that shared basis of trust. So they might agree on the high-level principle of, say, vulnerability disclosure until they realize that they can actually use some of these against each other, or until they realize that not disclosing something might, make a neighbor ever so slightly more vulnerable to attack than themselves. They might agree on the high-level principle of international cooperation and sharing information until they sit round the table and there's a bit of the, I show you mine if you show me yours, and no one really agrees. Enforcement mechanisms in international relations and international law are notoriously tricky because there is no single law enforcement power, no single judiciary to take on that role of enforcement, which means that it ultimately depends on states' receptiveness to the alternative enforcement mechanisms, so sanctions, international condemnation, any other diplomatic tools. And that doesn't really work when you have countries like China and Russia who, quite frankly speaking, don't give a shit. So neither of those two ways of having clear actions derived from norms are really working where nation states in their international channels are in the driving seat. So in turn, let's look why cross-border corporate action offers a way forward. The main rationale there is that corporates are driven by very different incentives, and that those incentives work to encourage them to use their power and their capabilities to actually do things rather than just talk about them. And I know at this point you're going, really? Corporates? Well, we can't even get them to do patching properly, let alone develop international cyber norms and action implementation plans. But there are three different motivations for corporates to do this that kind of come together in that space. One is pure self-interest, commercial interest above anything else. And that's to do with the fact that a lot of the technologies and systems that are persistently under cyber attack are owned and operated and want to be sold by the private sector. So securing them and making them more secure is good for the bottom line. Because, damage is costly and damaged consumer trust means people won't buy stuff. So, we really get to a point, where a more secure cyberspace offers a better operating environment for corporates. And corporates also often operate across borders, which means having 15 different regulatory regimes to comply with is pretty costly. So having a harmonized approach, which means they can do one thing and that's globally applicable, is a lot cheaper. So agreement on what a more secure cyberspace entails in practice is also a cheaper operating environment. The second motivation, the second element is this small but growing trend of a moral purpose. So global corporates are increasingly waking up to the fact that a pure focus on shareholder interest is not necessarily the right thing to do. So they are embracing slowly, but are embracing their responsibility in helping to tackle global challenges. And that's normally focused on social injustice, on inequality, on climate change and the environment. But, that's not to say that a secure cyberspace can't be part of that. So corporates are embracing or want to embrace the sort of aligning their corporate mission and using their resources and skills with what the world needs. And linked to that is the third element, which is opportunity, which is the current vacuum left by states' inability to do things, and the recognition that cyber is a shared space, the increasing recognition by governments that there is a role for corporates to play. So there really is an open invitation for the corporate world to step in and do the right thing. So that said, we know that there are at least two corporates that sort of have taken up that invitation and thought, let's do what we can do in that space. And we've got the Cybersecurity Tech Accord that is initiated and led by Microsoft, and we've got the Charter of Trust that's been initiated and is being led by Siemens. And what I've done is looked at the how, the why, the what of those initiatives. And they were both announced in the early months of 2018. So they've been in operation for just a little over a year. The corporates that are leading them are, global conglomerates, arguably with a clear interest in the technology space, in the future evolution of digital technology. They both used pretty well-known security fora to announce what they were doing, sort of increasing the visibility and the reach of their action, and yes, wanting a bit of kudos for what they were up to. But they both very keenly emphasize the broader industry involvement in what they're trying to do. So, you've got standalone logos, you've got standalone websites, you've got standalone documentation. So very keen that these are initiatives in their own right. They both have a level of public accountability to an extent, in that they publish publicly available reports readable by anyone to demonstrate what they've been up to, what they have achieved, what outcomes they have delivered. And they both follow this model of having high-level values or high-level principles that the signatories commit to. But then contrary, perhaps, to what's happening on the international state level, there is ongoing dialogue and meetings and action plans and agreements that try and take those principles and turn them into action. And so far, they have delivered outcomes, and that the Tech Accord have committed their signatories to publish vulnerability disclosure policies by the end of the year, and the Charter of Trust have developed a set of 17 supply chain security requirements that all the signatories have committed to forcing on their, requiring their supply chain to adhere to. So there are tangible outcomes that those initiatives have delivered to date. The difference between the Tech Accord and the Charter of Trust is predominantly in their rationale for being and the ultimate end state that they're working towards. So the Tech Accord, on the face of it, aims to create a secure online environment because all the signatories recognize that they have a responsibility to make that happen. So very much plays into the altruistic, the moral purpose, motivation that I talked about previously. The Charter of Trust, on the other hand, focuses on creating the right conditions for broader adoption of digital technologies. That's predominantly a commercially driven rationale, which plays into the self-interest motivation. The Tech Accord, in their principles and their actions, are focused on what the signatories themselves as corporates can do, and they position themselves very clearly vis-à-vis governments and sort of saying, we as corporates will not support offensive operations led by states. And they have remained an exclusively corporate forum. The Charter of Trust, while initially focused on the corporate measures that they can do, have as their ultimate aim the achievement of binding rules and regulations set by states, which also explains why their membership structure is slightly different in that they have this associate membership model, which allows them to work very closely with state and regulatory authorities. So what we can see is that, we have similar approaches across those corporate initiatives, but they do offer slightly different models, slightly different ways of going about things. On the whole, though, what we see is that corporates and corporate initiatives arguably are better at doing things that states struggle to do. So their endeavor or their motivation to tackle security risks of digital technology offers a shared driver. The fact that their collaboration, their ability to agree is completely voluntary. No one's forcing them. So they've come together with a shared purpose, which provides pretty fertile ground for outcome-driven discussion and outcome-driven objectives. Because at the end of the day, they're all busy people, so they don't really like wasting time and talking shops without anything coming out of this. And they have shown that they can deliver outcomes in a relatively short time frame. So we think that the UN process as currently starting is taking between 2 and 3 years to just arrive at a high-level declaration. They've come up with action plans in just a little over a year. So the timeframes are a lot quicker. But don't want to stand here and, hail the corporates. There are risks and shortcomings still. One of them is that while the signatories to both initiatives are globally active and globally operating, they are still pretty Western dominated. Microsoft is a US company. Siemens is a German company. European footprint, European heritage. You don't see many Russian or Chinese companies. So in that sense, it's not really that massive step up from what states are able to do in terms of in their regional groupings with like-minded people, they're able to arrive at conclusions and arrive at agreement much more quickly. But I would say that market drivers and market dependencies make it easier for those global corporates to attack or tackle those regional dominance issues in an easier way than it is for geopolitical entrenchments to be overcome by national governments. Discuss. And then the second shortcoming, the second limitation is that of democratic legitimacy. So at no point, I think, do we want to get to a situation where unelected, effectively unaccountable corporates are writing rules that everyone else has to agree with. And in fairness, the initiatives themselves recognize that in their working with governments, in their trying to sit together and work out where governments need to step in to do certain things. And that will ultimately also be required because there is a subset of cyber norms aspects that corporates can tackle. They can't set the rules for what responsible state behavior looks like in cyberspace, but their implementation of corporate practices and actions can set the framework and can set the parameters that ultimately facilitate the level of state discussions happening around that. So in order for us to, have the possibility and the ability to have a discussion about all this, I'll sort of swiftly move on, draw some conclusions, talk about some of the practical implementations. So, as we've seen, states will struggle to agree norms and will struggle to turn those norms into actions. The corporate world is much better at that for a variety of reasons, but corporate action in and of itself isn't sufficient either to tackle the big issue of developing global cyber norms, turning them into action. So what we need really is a model of true collaboration between states and governments and the private sector and the corporate world. What does that mean practically? What we need to make this true collaborative model work is a rethink of the traditional roles and responsibilities. And I'll just pick up this theme of radical creativity that I talked about at the start. There are three groups of actors, or three groups of stakeholders that in a way need to have a good hard look at themselves and do things differently. And that's governments themselves, that's corporate actors, and that's you and me and people like us. So what governments really need to do is to accept the private sector and accept the corporate world as a true collaborative partner. Not an adversary, not exclusively regulated entities, but they need to create institutional mechanisms to give corporate actors a seat at the table as those discussions are being had. How they do that can vary. So there is an option for governments to create a legal duty to force the corporate world to embrace their moral purpose and embrace their moral obligations. There is a way of incentivizing that, in other ways of rewarding corporations to do that voluntarily, either through tax breaks or investment support or grace periods for compliance or something. There is an argument to be made that in regular instances, states and governments should look at where corporate practice has got to and almost do a gap analysis and see where corporate action is ahead of where the norms discussion are at. And there might even be a political commitment to then sit down and codify and formalize what's already out there in terms of the norms development. There could be a mechanism of having, formal memorandum of understanding or partnership frameworks, but it's all sort of predisposed on the fact that corporates have a legitimate and accepted place at the table. In turn, the corporate world needs to show that they are actually deserving of that role. And that means embracing their moral responsibility. That means committing the resources to act in that space. That means overcoming competitive pressures, overcoming market rivalry, and really sitting down and finding that common ground and those shared drivers to commit. As for all of us, we really need to use the power that we hold to hold the actors to account. So if you look at the corporate world, we are highly skilled, highly desirable employees, and we are customers with significant purchasing power. So we really need to be adding to the motivation for corporate actors to play in that field, to do the right thing. And we need to be there to continuously hold them to account, to act as checks and balances, to ensure that what corporates commit to doing remains in the global interest, in the interest of the global community. So, I did say it's not all unicorns and rainbows, but there is a certain degree of utopianism in this discussion and those arguments. But I do genuinely believe that a rethink of roles and responsibilities is needed because, we've had 20 years of doing and trying to do the same thing over and over and over again. And it's not really delivered the outcomes that we're looking for. We have to accept that the cyberspace is a complex ecosystem of different actors that have different strengths and weaknesses. And the way in which they currently fulfill their roles doesn't really work to maximum effect in terms of using the strength and capabilities and mitigating the weaknesses and shortcomings. So if you agree that madness is defined as doing the same thing and expecting different outcomes, perhaps trying to do things differently with a view to expecting different outcomes is the same thing to do at this point. And with that, I will close and really hand things over to you. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? Paul.
Thank you, Gabe. It's a really interesting discussion. I just wondered, have you considered some of the cultural aspects of this and how some overseas countries view the problem very differently?
Yeah. Yes. So interestingly, one of the initial caveats that I wanted to put in is that I'm obviously looking at this consciously and subconsciously from a very Western perspective. And then part of me was thinking this opens a whole other rabbit hole that I don't have time to go into in much detail, and just sort of discarded it. But so I thought about it, didn't think about it in a lot of detail, but is a very valid point.
First of all, thank you for this informative and very thorough presentation. In a sentence or less, I find myself in complete agreement with you regarding your assertion regarding the efficiency of the corporate world as the most effective venue to advance the cause. I wonder if, in fact, the profit motive supersedes any other value or ethic, thus invalidating the entire argument.
Yeah, I find it very hard to disagree with you. I think this concept of moral purpose is relatively new and does require a lot more investigation and a lot more thought given to it. And it will, to counter your argument, I think we need a restructuring of the system. In that profit motive is no longer the pure motivator. But for the time being, yeah, you're probably right. But that's not to say that money can't drive the right behaviors if channeled in the appropriate ways.
You had a slide about the motivation of corporations and the 3 points you had. Did you double check with the initiatives you had which emerged last year, if the participants and affiliates and so had a similar motivation aligning with these 3 or more or less or something like that?
Sorry, say that again.
You had a slide with 3 motivations.
Yeah.
And last year 2 initiatives emerged. And a lot of petitions joined these affiliates and Microsoft and Siemens and some companies around it. And did they match with your proposed motivations?
Yeah.
Or did they have more or less?
So my interpretation is that the Microsoft initiative matches more with the moral purpose one. In that at least their public rationale for doing what they're doing is this heroic ambition to make the online space more secure for everyone, with the explanation that everyone has a responsibility to do that. So there is a very, in the rhetoric they use, there's a very, this is our responsibility, sort of thing, which matches the altruistic moral purpose side of things. The charter is pretty clear that, the failure to address, security in digital technology will reduce customers' trust of the products and services, which means a hit on their bottom line because they're less able to sell things. If that makes sense. And for that reason, I would argue that that fits the self-interest commercial motivation more. Though there is overlap and they all come to play. It's just a matter of a shade of difference as to which dominates the primary motivation, I would say.
We'll have time for one more question, and after I speak for a second, I would wonder just if if we look at the framing of both the moral purpose on the Microsoft side and the sort of more commercial interests that you're talking about in the supply chain thing, I'm wondering if we'll see that any sort of that vested frame that we're getting from those when we're taking industries where we don't have something where they're directly affecting it. Like it seems like the tech industry, I can see that moral imperative. You have the developers now who are all saying we should refuse work that's going to hurt people and so on, and ignoring the fact that they're lucky to say that. Different story. But outside of the tech industry, I'm still seeing very much the old school profit motive being huge, and I'm not sure if the frame of supply chain interest will encompass the moral eventually. It would be really interesting to see if that framing can be watched and pushed out of the tech sector.
Yeah.
I don't know of anyone looking at that yet, but
yeah, no, again, it's a really interesting question, and it is probably another shortcoming of that argument that it is the tech industry or the industry with interests in technology that are the primary drivers behind that. I was talking to someone last night who worked in a completely different sector, and they basically say, we're never going to cooperate across competitors. It's just not going to happen. Give it 10 years, if everything becomes technology, maybe there is a difference again in argument, but...
So the question is, you said in the beginning of this, you're throwing out the social science views to take a little bit more of an ambitious approach. Are you aware of anyone doing that type of review of a program like the tech sector, or the framing that leads to the moral imperative at a social science or research level?
I'm not, but that's not to say it isn't happening, because I'm not really embedded in academia, so it might well be that things are happening. If anyone's aware of anything, please let me know, because I am quite fascinated by this whole discussion.
Are there any more questions? Right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Kat.